Things Hidden. And Things Hidden, the podcast, continues. I'm David Gornoski, your host of this program. And this is a different program, of course, from our Neighbor's Choice program. A Neighbor's Choice airs on FM and AM, as well as live stream online on Facebook. And you can catch the replays on YouTube. Some of the select episodes get up on YouTube afterwards. And A Neighbor's Choice has a little bit different format. But on Things Hidden, we're doing a deep dive into how to understand the origins of violence, the origins of religion, the origins of culture, using Jesus and the Gospels from an anthropological, scientific perspective. And to do that, we pull from the field of mimetic theory, something that I have been developing and expanding upon and adding to as I seek to make these ideas that Jesus is communicating and what the early church was experiencing and what has affected Western civilization in particular for 2,000 years. I want to show how powerful these things are to understanding the headlines, understanding your own self, understanding your relationships, your family dynamics, your workplace environment, understanding your career, understanding, foreign policy, understanding the lack of innovation. All of these things you'll be able to see once you understand what Jesus is revealing when he came to reveal things hidden since the foundation of the world. So let's kick this off with a quote from René Girard, who's someone I pull from in some of this work. And his book here is called Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, which is a quote from Jesus, talking about what he's come to reveal, which is an anthropological understanding of the origins of man and society and how the Gospels will affect it. So here's a quote. He says, "To recognize Christ as God is to recognize him as the only being capable of rising above the violence that had up to that point absolutely transcended mankind. Violence is the controlling agent in every form of mythic or cultural structure, and Christ is the only agent who is capable of escaping from these structures and freeing us from their dominance. This is the only hypothesis that enables us to account for the revelation in the gospel of what violence does to us and the accompanying power of that revelation to deconstruct the whole range of cultural texts without exception." Right? We do not have to adopt the hypothesis of Christ's divinity because it has always been accepted by Orthodox Christians. Instead, this hypothesis is orthodox because in the first years of Christianity, there existed a rigorous, though not yet explicit, intuition of the logic determining the gospel text. A non-violent deity can only signal his existence to mankind by having himself driven out by violence, by demonstrating that he is not able to establish himself in the kingdom of violence. Now, when I was in D.C. recently, I was talking to some young activists that want to do the right thing and have a Christian background, many of them, and trying to make changes in a positive direction to benefit everyone. And I told them that politics is the domain of Satan, right? And that kind of threw them they made them shocked. Oh my goodness, how could you say that? But I meant that literally here because the kingdom of violence, God cannot establish himself within the perimeters of the kingdom of violence. Now, he will use that effort by mankind to set up governments of power, right? But he'll use whatever we're going to have because he's going to reveal himself one way or the other. But it's not the way of doing things the way he has patterned his role model in Jesus. That's not what he wants us to role model, using coercion. The early church was unanimous in this, and so is the gospel text in the New Testament, that there is no use for coercion within the Christian life to subdue your neighbor by force to get them to comply with the vision of the kingdom of heaven. There is no use of the imposition of coercion or dominance to make one's neighbor comply in a moral fashion. Now, is there a place for self-defense? I think you can make a clear case that there is, in the sense that, it's not a type of nonviolence. If someone is vulnerable, is being attacked, and you do nothing to stop that attack, I don't see how that's a place for Christian behavior, right? But as it pertains to all kinds of nonviolent behavior, drug use, greed, racism, hate, selfishness, any kind of vice or victimless behavior, however abhorrent it may be, there is no way that a Christian or someone who wants to imitate the role model of Jesus can use coercion to follow Jesus by making their neighbor, do something by force. That's not compatible with any witness in the church, in the early church, the leadership of the church, and then even, the gospel texts themselves and Paul's writings and so on. So the big mystery is, how is it that that's obvious and we know that in our own lives today, but then when we go into the voting booth or the jury box, somehow that slips our mind and we say, well, I'll just pick the lesser of two evils to initiate aggression and coercion on my behalf, because that's what's necessary to preserve our nation or whatever. That is incompatible with the ethic of imitating Jesus, because just because you're in a voting box or a jury box or whatever doesn't mean you have surrendered your imperative to imitate the non-coercion way of treating your neighbor that Christian followers of Jesus are supposed to abide by. But in order to understand this, I wanted to compare two texts. As Gerard points out in this quote, the kingdom of violence, of politics, and the powers of our world, they're falling apart. And Paul says, if the powers had known what they were doing, they would have not crucified the Lord of glory, the Master of glory, Jesus, because it will lead to their doom. It will lead to governmental powers falling apart and all of their crony powers, organizations, nonprofit groups, ways of thinking, philosophies, corporations that are all, empowered because of the coercion of the powers of our time, even today. So the gospel spells the end of the powers, right? And the question is, how are we going to do this the hard way or the easy way? And we typically choose the hard way. We choose to cling desperately to coercion, to subjugate our nonviolent neighbors overseas or across the street or across the state lines by any means necessary, so that we can have a unity and order based on coercion, based on compulsion, based on sacrifice. But that just has no place for someone who seriously wants to imitate Jesus. And again, whether you believe in God or understand all of the theology or not, I'm talking about people who really want to imitate what Jesus says he would like people to do. It's totally political. So I'm going to compare two texts today briefly, just to show you the difference between gospel revelation, which is nonviolence, which is the concern for the contrarian, the heretic, the misfit, the person who is the outsider, versus the way the world of the ancient world was done. So let's go to a story for Apollonius. Apollonius of Tyana was someone who was a pagan miracle worker, someone who was a relative contemporary of the time of Jesus himself. And he was compared by pagan apologists at the time as someone who was a superior miracle worker and figure of divinity and so forth, compared to the teachings of Jesus. But I want you to pay attention here to a text I'm going to quote in full to give you an indication as to what the ancient world, who is just now experiencing the message of Jesus start to percolate within the empire of Rome. And they're wanting to push back by presenting their own miracle worker in history who they perceive to be a superior model for what is the highest good, what is the highest way of doing society, what do the gods want from us. So here's a quote that is one of Apollonius's greatest, most spectacular deeds, and this is quoting from the book Saved from Sacrifice by S. Mark Heim, and he's quoting this account of Apollonius. There's an epidemic at Ephesus, and the Ephesians are looking for assistance. There's an epidemic going on. And it goes like this: "Take courage, for I will today put a stop to the course of the disease." And with these words, Apollonius led the population entire to the theater, where the image of the averting god Hercules has been set up. And there he saw what seemed an old mendicant, artfully blinking his eyes as if blind, and he carried a wallet and a crust of bread in it, and he was clad in rags and was very squalid of countenance. Apollonius therefore ranged the Ephesians around him and said, "Pick up as many stones as you can and hurl them at this enemy of the gods." Now the Ephesians wondered what he meant, and were shocked at the idea of murdering a stranger so manifestly miserable, for he was begging and praying them to take mercy upon him. Nevertheless, Apollonius insisted and egged on the Ephesians to launch themselves on him and not let him go. And as soon as some of them began to take shots and hit him with their first stones, the beggar, who had seemed to blink and be blind, gave them all a sudden glance and showed that his eyes were full of fire. Then the Ephesians recognized that he was a demon, and they stoned him so thoroughly that their stones were heaped into a great cairn around him. After a little pause, Apollonius bade them remove the stones and acquaint themselves with the wild animal which they had slain. When therefore they had exposed the object which they thought they had thrown their missiles at, they found that he had disappeared, and instead of him there was a hound who resembled in form and look a Molossian dog, but was in size the equal of the largest lion. There he lay before their eyes, pounded to a pulp by their stones, and vomiting foam as mad dogs do. According to the statue of the averting god named Hercules, has been set up over the spot where the ghost was slain. So in this text we see a mythic entrenched community encountering an early nascent Christian way of thinking infecting their pagan society in Ephesus, because the crowd has a little bit of hesitance at first to stone this beggar who's just walking around looking blind. But there's a plague, and Apollonius is able to egg the Ephesians on to grab the man and start throwing stones. It's not until the beggar sees them, he stops pretending to be blind, and he looks at the crowd, that they project their own hateful energy into his eyes, and they say that his eyes were full of hellfire. That is their way of projecting. Have you ever heard of that today? When you have a righteous, self-righteous mob looking at a little old lady trying to cross the street who has a different political opinion, and they look with that and they project hellfire into that little old lady that justifies them to shout horrible things and threaten to hurt them. See the same thing happening today. Then they start throwing stones. The first stones are thrown, and then the whole crowd goes into a frenzy of throwing stones. And then we see that the victim of this violence is so dehumanized that by the time they look past the stones to see what was under there, it's a hellhound, a mythological beast. So here we see kind of like a transitionary, remember how you have transitionary fossils, where you have there's this type of fossil, and then there's an intermediary step, and then there's another fossil that's more developed. This is like an intermediary, this is like a fossil transition in a text of the impact of Christianity, the impact of the story of Jesus in history. Because in ancient mythic texts, there was no beggar turns into a hellhound. It would be a beast from the beginning, a demon that's flying around, and then they do something. So the violence is more hidden, and the victim is more fully dehumanized. There's no partial human and then partially found out to be a hellhound, like you see in this text. Because this is a community that has recently been infected with the way of thinking of the world, like the story of Jesus says, which is that, there's no place for violence. There's no place for collective violence. God doesn't desire you to, sacrifice somebody to avert a plague. So that, remember Ephesians, the book, the story of Jesus has already infected the Ephesus community. So when this plague is going on, there's already some of that impact of the Christian way of thinking of the world that's already starting to percolate, even in this crowd that's formed that Apollonius uses to kill, to create this sacrificial kind of blessing for the community to avert the plague. And it's interesting here that the pagan apologists that are trying to show that Jesus is inferior to their way of the world, their worldview, they think that telling this story of Apollonius averting a plague by stoning a blind beggar with a crowd, they think that's a mark of excellence, of superiority. Now, today, the modern world would say, oh, wow, how quaint, right? Because we don't realize how fully Christian our moral compass has been infected and influenced in. So we just take it for granted that, of course, that's you don't stone beggars to make the community get better. But it's interesting also that modern people often point out Apollonius as a, superior, miracle worker, and that Jesus was just a copy, right? Because they don't want to recognize, it's like killing the messenger, right? They want to kill the messenger, which is Jesus. And Jesus points a mirror back at all societies, saying, every one of you renounce your violence, renounce your desire to blame other people for your problems. Okay? So that's why if you go online today and look up Apollonius and Jesus, you'll see all kinds of little, internet blogs and YouTube videos trying to say, look, Jesus is just a ripoff of Apollonius. That's because humans still have a desire to kill the messenger. They don't want to fully face-to-face, and even Christians, right? They don't fully get it. They come up with theological constructs to import violence and vengeance back into the heart of the gospel where it's not even there. So we all have a proclivity to want to excuse our addiction to collective coercion. And even in this text with Apollonius early on here, when this city of Ephesus has been infected with the gospel, there's a little bit of hesitance that's already starting to show itself in this recording by a pagan person who's recording this story of Apollonius. But it's just clear to see, think of this as like a kind of an ancient news report, but you see all the mythological trappings of concealing violence. That, oh no, it's okay to kill a beggar because it turned out it was a hellhound after all. Oh, it's okay to kill a beggar. I looked into his eyes, I saw hellfire, right? That's the way all the world thought before Christianity came onto the scene. In various ways, that's how the world functioned. And in some ways, that's what created safety, because people if there's a plague, people go crazy. People get stressed out. That's why today, when there's the fears of economic collapse, people say everybody's going to run into the streets and go crazy, right? So we know that there's a tendency when times get tough for humans to go, nuts or get aggressive. And so in the pagan world, in this Roman period, in this Greek period, as well as around the world, the way of the world was when something was wrong, you blamed a common enemy and you killed them. And that was somehow remembered in the text, the news of the time, as averting the chaos and avoiding the plague. They attached social crazes with things like plagues and diseases and famines. So it's kind of an interesting connection there that they always like to link to. I'm going to bring it now back to a modern piece of myth making, really just to tie this up. So here's an article from New Scientist called "A Drug May Prevent Alzheimer's, but There Are No Plans to Find Out." This is by Deborah McKenzie. Now, it's not that I'm not picking at this article. I'm not saying, oh, New Scientists, they're bad. It's just an example of how we think we're so far away from myth making today, but we don't realize how our text, consider this as the same thing as the Apollonius text. It's obviously infected by way more realistic scientific language. And that's because of what Christianity did to make the West move away from sacrificial impulse. But still, coercion is hidden in our myth-making attempts at news because we're enclosed by groupthink. We're enclosed by the inability to see outside of what we trust to be the authority on things. And so this story is an innocent attempt to try to tell you the truth, but I'll show you how it's infected by vestiges of the same myth-making that justified and hid the violence that Apollonius did in the lynching of a beggar to avoid the plague. It says, an arthritis drug seems to significantly cut the risk of developing Alzheimer's, but there are no plans to find out if it really works. Last week, the Washington Post reported that pharmaceutical firm Pfizer has data showing that an arthritis treatment it owns called Enbrel may also lower the risk of getting Alzheimer's by 64%. But according to critics, Pfizer has elected not to develop the drug for this condition because the patent on it will soon expire, meaning the company won't profit from pursuing it further. Pay attention to that note. So Pfizer says, however, the patent wasn't a factor. They said they looked at the data. They didn't really see enough justification to continue to invest in that category. So I'm going to move on into the story. It says, I'm going to go on. Other people have looked at, the State University of New York at Buffalo, and his colleagues published their own analysis of insurance records of 300 odd people with rheumatoid arthritis. Those on Enbrel were about a third as likely to get Alzheimer's as those on other treatments. Small trials in Taiwan and the UK have also found that Enbrel may improve Alzheimer's symptoms, right? And it says, we have been saying for a decade that mopping up TNF, which is what the drug Enbrel does, will have a beneficial effect on Alzheimer's, says Bryce Vissel at the University of Technology in Sydney. He is frustrated that a full-blown trial still hasn't been done. And then it just goes on that there's all these people saying we need to do this, but Pfizer, since they own the patent on it, they don't feel any need to want to pursue it further. And the article ends that nevertheless, no major company capable of organizing large, long study looks likely to risk setting up another expensive Alzheimer's trial anytime soon. And the article concludes, if companies can't develop such vital drugs, some observers, have suggested other ways should be found, such as government funding. Oh, interesting. With Alzheimer's expected to affect some 56 million people by 2030, there is no doubt the drugs are badly needed. So we can agree on that, right? Something needs to happen. Now, what's interesting from this, and this, again, has nothing to do with the personal writer. It has everything, because I see these types of stories in almost every news outlet that you read. Science, politics, economics, anything, medicine. But what we see here is a deliberate groupthink bias that subconsciously, I'm not going to use the word deliberate. I'm just going to say there's a groupthink bias that prohibits the author from reporting the truth of the reality of the situation in a more truthful way. And that is that the FDA, the process itself, is what makes it difficult for people to afford the approval process to get a drug through the market process to become FDA approved so that they can make health claims like X entity or X product does X or does this to whatever, disease they want to make a claim about. So it's the FDA approval process, which is a monopoly group that determines what is safe for you to put in your body. And if you put a claim that you used Enbrel and it helped you, get reduction of Alzheimer's probability, and you will go to prison if you have not had that approved by the FDA. So that imposition of coercion, which I just got done saying, has no place in a person following Jesus. But somehow we think it's magically okay if a collective body like the FDA does it for us. What it ends up doing is it retards the ability of knowledge to advance at a degree it should, because we can't see what we don't know. And so the author of this article doesn't tell you, it basically implies that, well, it sounds a little bit like this company, Pfizer, is greedy, which is kind of like looking at the symptom. Of course, Pfizer's greedy. But, Pfizer wouldn't have this kind of situation if it wasn't protected from competition from other people providing other solutions for something like Alzheimer's that, would be able to have a chance in the market if the FDA did not put prior restraint and criminalize claims about substances, herbs, minerals, nutrients, diets, and their effect on certain illnesses. They criminalize it preemptively. And so the only way you can afford to go through the FDA approval process is if you're a giant pharmaceutical company with tons and tons and tons of money to afford the approval process. So do you see how you think, if you listen to TED Talks and these people, sorry, not to pick on them, but you think that we're so far removed from the world of mythology, but I'm showing you that this news piece is not so much different from Apollonius. It's hiding from you things hidden since the foundation of the world. It's hiding from you the fact that the FDA situation itself is what precludes this potential drug. I don't know whether it works or not, but it doesn't even have a fair chance because the only way you can afford having a claim of commercial viability for something making some disease better is if you can get it patented. And so, Pfizer has no incentive, no company has any incentive to spend the tons and tons of money to validate this potential alleviation of Alzheimer's because there's no ability to patent it. So the FDA approval process only biases patented substances, which means diet changes, natural solutions, fasting, all that stuff. You can't make any health claims legally about them helping anything. So we're missing out because all the money is then funded towards patentable solutions for diseases. Do you see this? So millions of you, including me and our families, are suffering with ignorance and blind darkness because we don't know how to see through myth. We don't know how to see through the fake news of media making, myth making stuff in the news and government and see through it and see how we're missing out on facts. We're missing out. This story does not tell you, like what I would tell you on my news program with the people doing it, that dietary change like eating a ketogenic diet or primarily healthy meat diet could actually have even more tremendous effects at preventing Alzheimer's. There are a lot of people, psychiatrists, people in the field of research using this diet to find tremendous results. They won't tell you that, so that's missing from the piece. So who is the victim in here? The victim is hidden, just like in the story of Saved from Sacrifice. You think if you read the text from Apollonius, you'll think, oh, look, the victim is clearly seen. But today, it's harder for us to see the victims that are hidden in our own myth making in the news. We don't realize we're the victims. We don't realize that the FDA is presumed to be sacred, just like the gods of Apollonius's day were presumed to be sacred, and that it's okay to use coercion to sacrifice some, including you and our freedoms and our health, for the greater good, which ends up not actually being for the greater good, but for the greater good for a select few who have access to controlling the violence of the state. So that's how you can understand headlines today, folks. It's so important that you get this. So I've put in a lot of data, rewatch it again, and this is Things Hidden with David Gornoski. You can email me, david@aneighborschoice.com, and I'll see you next week.